The dog had not eaten in 19 days. The veterinarians at the Trenton shelter had tried everything. High-value treats, appetite stimulants, syringe feeding, earfields. Calming pheromones diffused through the kennel block. They had brought in a canine behaviorist from Queen's University who had published 2 papers on grief responses in working dogs. She had sat with him for 4 hours on a Tuesday, speaking in a low, measured voice, offering chicken liver from her palm. He had not even looked at it, had simply lain at the back of his enclosure, his great tan and black head resting on his forepaws, amber eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance that did not exist in any room any of them could enter. His name was Kodiak. He was a 7-year-old German Shepherd, former RCMP police service dog, out of Depot Division in Regina, and for 5 years his world had consisted entirely of one man, Corporal Theodore Allard. They had worked the drug interdiction unit together out of the Winnipeg detachment, then transferred jointly to the Border Task Force at Fort Erie. Allard had been killed in a traffic collision on the QEW in November, struck from behind by a transport truck while he stood at the roadside with a detainee. He was 41 years old. He had a daughter in Guelph, and a season's worth of firewood stacked behind his house that would never be burned. Jack had been in the cruiser's rear compartment when it happened. He was uninjured. That was what the intake report said, under the heading physical condition. Uninjured. The woman who typed that word had no column for the other kind. For 3 weeks, the shelter staff had managed his water intake carefully, else coaxing small amounts of broth into him via syringe when the vet deemed it necessary to prevent organ failure. They kept his kennel clean and his bedding replaced. They were professional, and they were kind, and they were completely unable to reach him. He existed in the shelter the way a stone exists at the bottom of a river, present, immovable, indifferent to the current moving around him. It was Marlene Okafor, a weekend volunteer who had retired from the Ontario Veterinary College after 30 years, who made the call. She had not told the shelter's director, Dr. Pauline Voss, what she was doing. Sonmu. She had simply driven out to the property east of Napanee on a Saturday morning, unannounced, because the man she was looking for did not have a mobile phone, and his old address was the only contact information she had from a file that was itself 20 years out of date. The property was 8 acres of mixed bush and cleared pasture. The lane was gravel, deeply rutted, and the mailbox at the road had no name on it, only the municipal number stenciled in faded black paint. It was a woodlot, a modest house with a covered porch, a barn that leaned slightly to the north from decades of prevailing wind and splitting wood in the side yard, who did not look up when her car came down the lane. His name was Sullivan. That was what Marlene knew him by, and it was the only name she used. Epi Fields. He was 67 years old, or thereabouts. She had never been entirely certain, and his face did not resolve the question. It was a face that had been outdoors in every season for a very long time, creased and weathered and assembled around a pair of pale gray eyes that did not miss much. He was not a large man, medium height, lean, with the kind of functional musculature that comes from actual work rather than any deliberate cultivation of it. His hair was white and cut short, canvas work pants, and a flannel-lined denim jacket and boots that had been repaired so many times. The stitching was a patchwork of different threads. He was, as far as the county was concerned, a retired agricultural equipment mechanic who had come to the Napanee area roughly 15 years ago and who kept mostly to himself and gave nobody any trouble. Marlene knew differently. Had known him for 32 years, since a particular evening in a particular office in Ottawa, where she had been asked to consult on the psychological assessment of several individuals whose exact roles she was not cleared to understand. Sullivan had been one of them. She had never learned his full name. She had never asked the years. Through channels she did not examine too closely. She had come to understand that he had spent several decades in quiet service to the country, in contexts where the structure was informal and the stakes were absolute, and that he had a particular relationship with dogs that fell outside any training manual she had ever read. He called on him twice before. Both times he had helped. Both times he had asked for nothing and said very little about what he'd done. 3 more pieces of birch before he set the maul down and looked at her. "You drove a long way," he said. "There's a dog," she said. He picked up the maul again, drove it through another round. A wood fell cleanly in 2 halves. "Tell me," he said. She told him. All of it. Kodiak's history, the accident, the 19 days, the behaviorist from Queens, the broth syringes, the amber eyes fixed on nothing. Sullivan listened without interrupting, his rhythm with the maul unbroken. As she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What does the doctor in charge want?" he asked. "She doesn't know I'm here." He nodded, just once, as if this was not surprising. He set the maul against the splitting block and pulled a pair of work gloves from his jacket pocket and began stacking the split wood against the barn wall, piece by piece, taking his time about it. "I'll come Wednesday," he said. Dr. Epney, deputy rezoned. Pauline Voss was 44 years old and held dual certifications in veterinary medicine and applied animal behavior. She had done her residency at the Ontario Veterinary College and her postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Edinburgh's Royal School of Veterinary Studies. She had worked with traumatized animals for 16 years. In the field, she kept her dark hair cut short and her opinions considered and her standards high. And she was, in her private assessment, running out of options with Kodiak Ashburn. When Marlene came to her on Tuesday and explained what she had arranged, Pauline's first reaction was a carefully managed silence, which was her professional alternative to the response she actually felt. "I've brought in a civilian," she said. "I've brought in someone who may be able to help, Marlene. This dog has been evaluated by specialists. He's on a monitored rehydration protocol. He is not a project for a," she paused, chose the word with precision, "a well-meaning amateur." Marlene looked at her with the particular patience of someone who has watched bright young people be confidently wrong before and has stopped being surprised by it. "He isn't an amateur," she said, "because he's just not credentialed." "What does that mean?" "It means he knows things that aren't in any credential and consented to the visit." And because she respected Marlene and because the behaviorist from Queens had quietly suggested in her final notes that she had nothing further to offer Sessions Fields, she consented with the clarity that she was doing so out of professional exhaustion rather than professional conviction. And she told herself this distinction mattered. Ascension. Sullivan arrived at 9 in the morning in a truck that was older than several members of the shelter staff. He wore the same canvas work pants and a clean flannel shirt, pale blue, worn soft. He had a canvas tote bag over one shoulder, and he moved through the parking lot with an unhurried, economical gait that Marlene recognized, and that Pauline, without knowing why, found herself paying attention to. At the entrance, and gave him the summary she gave all visiting consultants. Kodiak's history, his physical condition, the current protocol, the risks of further caloric restriction. April. Sullivan listened without a notepad or a phone or any visible means of recording. He asked one question. "Has anything been placed in his kennel that belonged to the handler?" "His service vest," Ellen said. "For the first week, upper. We removed it when it appeared to be increasing his agitation." Sullivan nodded. He asked no further questions. The block was long and fluorescent lit, smelling of disinfectant and animal warmth. The other dogs responded to a stranger's entry the way shelter dogs always do. A cascading chorus of barks and whines rippling from kennel to kennel. "Oh, Sullivan, walked through it without any visible reaction, his eyes moving steadily down the row until they found the kennel that was silent. Kodiak lay at the back of his enclosure. He was a large dog, roughly built, with a saddle of deep black over a body of warm tan, and in health he would have been a striking animal. He was thinner now than his intake weight, yet his coat had lost the sharp luster that came from a mind that was fully engaged with being alive. He did not look up when Sullivan stopped in front of his kennel. He did not register the new presence in any way that Pauline's instruments could measure. Sullivan stood at the kennel door for a long time, perhaps 2 minutes, without moving. He was not looking at the dog's eyes or his coat or his breathing. Thus, Pauline realized, looking at the floor of the kennel, at the scratch marks along the side wall, the untouched water bowl. A bedding had been pressed flat in one specific corner and nowhere else. "He's keeping the post," Sullivan said. It was quiet enough that Pauline almost missed it. "I'm sorry," she said. Sullivan turned slightly and looked at her. His gray eyes were not unkind, but they were extremely direct. "He's still on duty," he said. "He hasn't stood down. One who's come in here has been trying to pull him off the post. He won't leave it. That's not pathology. That's loyalty." Pauline felt something move in her chest that she chose not to examine closely. Oppose. "I'd like to sit with him for a while. I don't need anything. Maybe a chair if one's available." Marcus, a shelter staff member, who had been hovering near the supply cabinet listening with unconcealed interest, was already moving before Pauline finished her nod. Offer. He came back with a folding chair and held it out to Sullivan, with the careful formality of someone doing something that felt, obscurely, like an honor. Sullivan took it with a quiet word of thanks, down the concrete aisle, and placed it approximately 8 feet from Kodiak's kennel door, angled slightly so that he was not facing the dog directly. He sat. He placed his canvas bag on the floor beside him. He put his hands on his knees, palms down, and became still. Pauline stood at the far end of the block with Marlene and Marcus watching. "What is he doing?" Marcus asked. He was 26 and had a genuine gift for working with frightened animals, and he was watching Sullivan with the focused attention of someone who has recognized, without being able to say why, witnessing something instructive. "Nothing," said Pauline. Then, correcting herself quietly, "Waiting." An hour passed. The shelter moved around the still point of the old man and the silent dog. Volunteers came through to walk other animals, to deliver midday water, to clean adjacent kennels. Sullivan did not acknowledge any of them. Own Husty. He sat with the unharried settledness of a man who has waited in much less comfortable circumstances for much longer stretches of time, and for whom patience was not a virtue so much as a physical state he knew how to inhabit. He checked the monitoring readout for Kodiak's kennel every 15 minutes. Heart rate steady at 51 beats per minute. Respiration regular. No voluntary movement. At the 90-minute mark, Etchers touched her arm. "Look," he said. She looked. Kodiak's right ear, the one on the side of the kennel closest to Sullivan, had rotated backward by a fraction. It was the movement of an antenna seeking a signal. The dog's head had not lifted. His eyes had not opened, ever, but something in him was listening. 20 minutes later, the ear returned to neutral. Pauline let out a breath she had apparently been holding. It was nearly 2 in the afternoon when a staff member named Jockey came through the block to clean the kennel 2 doors down from Kodiak's, humming to herself. And she was not aware of the particular gravity of the room she was entering. She set her cleaning bucket down on the concrete with a sharp, resonant clang. Jack's body went rigid. His transformation was instantaneous. One moment an inert shape on a blanket, the next a coiled assembly of muscle and professional reflex, every tendon tuned and waiting. A sound came from deep in his chest, not quite a growl. Something lower and more warning than that. His heart rate, visible on Pauline's monitor, jumped to 114 as Sullivan's right hand lifted from his knee. Just the hand, nothing else moving, palm downward, and lowered it back to his thigh in one slow, deliberate press. The gesture was minimal. A person watching without context might have thought he was smoothing his trousers. Sound from Kodiak's chest stopped. The rigidity flowed out of his body like water finding level. He remained where he was, but the operational tension was gone. His heart rate began to fall. Jackie, unaware, finished setting up her cart and began cleaning the adjacent kennel. Abert resumed his stillness. At the far end of the block, Marcus said, very quietly, "Did he just?" "Yes," said Pauline. She pulled up the heart rate graph on her tablet and looked at the spike and the decline. The decline was too steep, too immediate, to be spontaneous habituation. It was a response. Something had passed between that man and that dog that her instruments could record the shadow of, but not the substance. She found herself walking down the block towards Sullivan, which she had not planned to do. "That wasn't a standard calming signal," she said, keeping her voice low. "I know the literature on calming signals. That wasn't in it." Sullivan glanced at her sideways. "No," he agreed. "Where did that come from?" He was quiet for a moment. "Same place the dog learned his," he said. "Operational practice, some of it codified, of it just understood." Pauline looked at him for a moment, then looked at Kodiak, who had settled again into his posture of vigil. "You've worked with service dogs before," she said, as not entirely a question. "Among other things," Sullivan said. She went back to the end of the block. She did not go to her office. She stood with Marlene and watched. At 3 p.m, as Fields, Sullivan reached into his canvas bag and removed a small paper-wrapped parcel. He unwrapped it on his knee. Dried venison, home-cured, cut into strips. He had made it himself, from a deer taken in November on his own property, cured with salt and black pepper, and a little maple, over apple wood for 4 hours. It smelled of the outdoors in a way that the interior of the shelter did not. Wood, winter air, something alive. He did not offer it to the dog. He took a piece himself and ate it slowly, chewing with a calm, unhurried jaw. The scent spread through the disinfectant-cleaned air of the kennel block like a word spoken quietly in a loud room. Kodiak's nose moved, once. Then, 40 seconds later, again. Then, with the slow deliberateness of a man rising under a great weight, the dog lifted his head. He did not look at Sullivan, ever. He lifted his head 4 inches off his paws and turned his face slightly toward the air between them, his nostrils working through the information. It was the most active Pauline had seen him in 19 days. Her hand had tightened on her tablet without her noticing. Sullivan ate 2 more pieces. Then he placed a 4th piece on the concrete floor, approximately 5 feet in front of him, and returned his hands to his knees. Kodiak's eyes found the jerky. Something shifted behind them. Not animation exactly, but the first evidence of calculation. As a working dog, bred and trained and experienced over years of active service, and the machinery of his cognition had not stopped. It had only had nothing worth running for. A piece of venison sat on the concrete, and he watched it, and he did not move. Sullivan did not move either. He gave the dog what every other person in the building had failed to give him, which was not food or therapy or stimulation, but simply the absence of demand. He sat in that kennel block and occupied his space with the easy authority of someone who has nothing to prove and nowhere else to be, and he waited for the dog to decide for himself what came next. Marcus, watching all of this with an expression of concentrated respect, leaned over to Pauline and said in a low voice, "My old platoon sergeant used to say something like this, as who came back wrong. He said you couldn't order them home, go and find them where they were. Pauline looked at him. It was the first time it had occurred to her that Marcus might have been in the military, and she realized she had never asked. Kodiak lowered his head back to his paws, and then, 6 minutes later, he began to crawl. Not walking, not standing. He moved from his position at the back wall on his belly, his chin low, his legs pushing him forward in a movement that was deliberate and profoundly careful, as though the air between him and the kennel door had been mined, and he was crossing it by instinct and training. He moved to the front of his enclosure and stopped with his nose 3 inches from the chain link. He looked at Sullivan. It was the first direct sustained eye contact the dog had made with any person since his arrival. Amber eyes were exhausted. They held the particular quality of someone who has stood watch alone for a very long time and cannot quite allow themselves to believe the relief is real. Sullivan turned his head and met the dog's gaze. He did not smile. He did not speak. He looked at the dog with a quiet steadiness that Pauline could not have described precisely, but that she felt as a kind of gravity. The look of a man who understood a level that had nothing to do with training manuals, what it was to carry, something that was too heavy to put down and too important to drop. After a moment, he blinked. A slow, deliberate closing and opening of his eyes. Kodiak held his gaze for another long breath. Something left his body. A vast, accumulated tension that had been present so long it had begun to seem like the dog himself. He exhaled, long and ragged, his chin on the concrete floor just inside the kennel door. His eyes stayed on Sullivan's face, but they were softer now. Not peaceful, not healed, but no longer entirely alone. This had revealed. Sullivan sat with him for another 30 minutes, until the dog's breathing had settled into something approaching natural sleep. Then he rose, slowly, quietly, his knees audible, picked up the piece of venison from the floor, dusted it against his pants leg, and carried it to the kennel door. He did not try to open it. He slid the venison under the gap along the bottom, nudging it inside with one finger until it was about 8 inches into the kennel. Then he picked up his bag and his chair and walked back down the aisle. "Ate that tonight," Sullivan said when he reached Pauline and Marlene. "After the lights go down and there's no one watching. That's fine. Don't make anything of it when the bowl's empty in the morning. Just refill it. Quietly. Whoever brings it should be the same person every time, if you can manage it. And they shouldn't look at him directly when they come in. Put the bowl down and walk away." Pauline was writing in her notebook. She was aware, distantly, that she had not opened this notebook for any of the 3 previous consultants. "Tomorrow, I'll come back," he said. "Same time." He looked at her notebook, then at her face. "Your methods are good, Doctor. They're designed for dogs that are lost. He isn't lost, exactly where he is. He's just waiting for someone to stand watch with him." "And what are you doing when you sit there?" she asked. "A scientist for 20 years. And she wanted the mechanism. She wanted the variables she could isolate. Game fields. Sullivan considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Keeping him company in the place he's in," he said. "Most people try to move a grieving animal out of its grief. You can't. Go into it with them. Show them the grief is survivable. That there's someone on the other side of it who isn't going anywhere." He adjusted the strap of his canvas bag on his shoulder. "He's not broken," he said. "He's honoring something, a difference." He gave a small nod to Marlene, then to Pauline, then to Marcus, and walked toward the exit with the same quiet, balanced tread he'd arrived with, his boots barely audible on the concrete. The venison was gone when Marcus opened the kennel block the next morning. Sullivan came back at 9. This time he placed his chair directly in front of Kodiak's kennel rather than 8 feet away. And Kodiak was already there when he arrived. Not at the back wall, but at the front, lying with his chin on his paws near the door. When Sullivan settled into the chair, The dog's tail lifted once, briefly, from the concrete, and came back down. As Pauline watched this from 12 feet away and found she needed to look at the floor for a moment. Sullivan ate his venison, just pieces inside the kennel. Kodiak ate them, still lying down, reaching slightly forward for each piece without altering his position at the door. After some time, Sullivan began to speak, low and conversational, his voice not carrying more than a few feet. The words were indistinct. The tone was not. It spoke to the dog the way one speaks to a colleague between operations. Not commanding, not soothing, simply present and direct, as if the dog were someone whose understanding he did not doubt and whose experience he respected. On the third day, Sullivan came in and asked for the kennel key. Pauline felt the alarm in her chest, as a 90-pound Belgian Malinois. She began and then stopped, because she had been about to say German Shepherd, and she was not even certain in this moment what was true and what was protocol. German Shepherd, Sullivan said, as if he had heard the correction she hadn't made. And I know. He looked at her with those gray eyes. He and I have an understanding, Doctor. She gave him the key, was not sure, later, when she thought about it, why she had done so without more argument. Something in his manner made the question of his competence feel irrelevant, as certain questions simply stop being questions in the presence of certain people. Sullivan did not go immediately to the latch, beside the kennel door, with his body angled slightly away from it, one hand resting on the frame, not gripping. He waited. Inside the kennel, Kodiak sat up and watched him with full attention, ears forward, reading every signal in the man's posture and breathing and scent. Then Sullivan slid the key in, turned it, and pushed the door open. He did not enter immediately. He stood in the doorway for a breath, letting the threshold exist without demanding it be crossed. He walked into the kennel and went to the back wall. Checked water nozzle, running his thumb along it. It nudged the blanket slightly with his boot. These were the small, proprietary movements of a man taking quiet responsibility for a space, and Kodiak tracked every one of them with absolute attention. Effie Fields. Sullivan sat down on the concrete floor against the back wall and patted the space beside him. Kodiak stood. He moved across the kennel with a gravity that was not hesitation but ceremony, each step considered, and he did not sit beside the old man. He lay down against his leg, pressing his flank firmly into Sullivan's thigh, and faced the kennel door with a posture that was not anxiety but vigilance. Still on watch, but with someone beside him at last. Sullivan brought his hand up from below the dog's jaw, slowly, and scratched at the thick muscle there. Jack made a sound that came from somewhere deep in his chest. A long, ragged exhalation of something that had been held for 19 days. And he leaned into the contact with his whole body. At the kennel door, Marcus looked away briefly. His throat had tightened in a way he was mildly embarrassed about, and completely unable to prevent. Sullivan sat there with one hand on the dog and talked to him for a long time. Not commands, not therapeutic language. He talked to him the way you talk to someone who has come back from somewhere hard, in a voice that doesn't ask anything of them, that simply acknowledges what they carried and how well they carried it. Then his left hand moved. A precise, compact movement, 3 fingers closing, a particular angle, a tap against his own collarbone. It was fast, and it was not in any manual. Kodiak's head came up, his ears sharpened, up his body, which had been relaxed against Sullivan's leg, settled into a different kind of attention. Not anxious, not aggressive, but operational. He was alert in the way he had been trained to be alert. The grief had not gone. But for a moment it had been set aside by something older than the grief, something that had been there when he was first trained and had never stopped being true. Sullivan said a word. It was a single syllable, quiet and precise, in what sounded to Pauline like French. She caught the shape of it, but not the whole word. something clipped and releasing. Kodiak shook himself from ears to tail, one full body rotation as if shedding water, and then turned and put his nose against Sullivan's jawline and held it there for a moment, his nostrils working. Sullivan did not move. The dog licked him, once, across the side of his face, and sat back and looked at him with amber eyes that held something different in them than they had for 19 days. Still sad. Still carrying something that would never fully be put down. But present. Back inside his own body and his own life, at least enough to feel the weight of the person beside him. Sullivan stayed another hour, safer. He groomed the dog with a brush he produced from his bag, working slowly through the coat from shoulders to haunches while he talked, just still too low to catch, but the rhythm of them steady and calm and respectful. When he finally stood, Kodiak stood with him, and they walked together to the kennel door, his shoulder against the man's knee. And Sullivan stepped out and secured the door and handed the key back to Pauline. "He'll want his meals on a regular schedule," Sullivan said. "Same time every day. Feed him in his kennel for now, not out in the run. He needs the structure back before he needs the space. Short walks on leash within the week. Heel position, not loose lead. The structure is what he's been missing as much as anything." Pauline nodded, writing quickly. Sullivan looked at the closed kennel, fields, where Kodiak had returned to the front of his enclosure and was watching him through the chain link. "There are people and organizations that work to place dogs like him with the right adopter," he said. "Veterans groups. Some of the service dog programs. He's too young and too capable to spend his life in here, and he's too much dog for a civilian home that doesn't understand what he is." He paused. "He doesn't need someone to rescue him. He needs someone who can be his next assignment." He picked up his bag. It looked from Pauline to Marcus to Marlene, and his expression was not warm exactly, but it was not impersonal either. It was the look of a man who respects the work people are trying to do, even when he understands it differently than they do. "You've taken good care of him," he said. "The physical care was right, etc. He seemed to consider how to put it. You were trying to help him decide to live. You can't do that for anyone. Only be present while they decide." He gave his small, final nod and walked toward the exit. Marcus called after him. "Mr. Sullivan." The name came out with the instinctive weight of a rank attached to it. "Is the signal you used. The word. That wasn't standard." Sullivan stopped but did not turn. "No," he said. "It wasn't. You worked with dogs in." Marcus hesitated. "In a different kind of unit." On, a pause. Still not turning. "There are all kinds of service," he said. "Not all of it ends up in the official record. Some of it just ends." He walked on, and the door at the end of the block swung closed behind him. Marcus and Pauline stood in the echoing quiet. From his kennel, Kodiak watched the door for a long moment after Sullivan had gone through it. Then he turned, circled once on his blanket, a thing none of them had ever seen him do, and lay down with his chin on his paws and his eyes, for the first time since his arrival, pointed at the middle distance with something in them that was less like a vigil and more like rest. A door. 6 months later, Kodiak was placed with a retired RCMP officer in Peterborough, a woman named Bergeron, who had lost her own service partner to cancer the previous year and who had been vetted through the placement program Sullivan had mentioned, and careful about the match, the way Sullivan had said to be careful. And Bergeron had driven to the shelter 3 times before anything official was decided. The last 2 times without staff present, just herself and the dog in a small yard behind the building, getting acquainted without an audience. The day Bergeron took him home, Marcus was on shift. He walked Kodiak out to her truck on leash, and at the passenger door, the dog stopped and looked back at the shelter building for a moment. In the particular way, dogs look at things they are remembering. He jumped in, and the truck pulled out of the lot. And Marcus stood in the November morning, with his hands in his jacket pockets, and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled since November a year before. He had looked up hand signals from special operations units afterward, a Canadian, American, British. He had found nothing that matched what Sullivan had used in that kennel. He had found nothing that matched the word either. He had tried French and Dutch and one or two others. He had decided eventually to let it go. Some things he had come to understand were not in the record because the record was not their home. I've instead in the places where two people, or a person and a dog, had sat in the same quiet and trusted each other enough to stay. That was where Sullivan lived, he thought, in the space between what is documented and what is real. And Kodiak was going home.